Good evening, everyone, and well, afternoon from California for those who are on the East Coast versus West Coast. Thank you all for joining tonight's real conversation entitled Beyond the Darkness of the Moment, Juneteenth, 1865 till 2022. I'll definitely say, pardon me, I just had oral surgery and I'm still recovering, so my speech might be a little bit impacted, but we got this. So, who am I? My name is Roshanna Bell, and I serve as the new virtual programs co-chair for the University of Rochester's Black Alumni Network. From a professional perspective, I'm a senior finance manager at Intel Corporation here in California. I also have experience working in banking and also in technology, aka tech. As you can see, I have this big Simon shirt. I actually got my MBA from Simon Business School in 2016 with a focus in corporate finance. During my time at Simon, I was actually the president of the former Simon National Black MBA Association, and I'm also alumna of the Consortium Fellowship. Outside of my professional career and my endeavors, I'm a proud immigrant hailing from Jamaica. I was raised between Toronto, Canada, and New York City. So, Dr. Kreshlo, we have some commonalities there. So, I definitely want to highlight that. I come from a very large family and I'm an avid traveler. So, why am I here today? And, the intent of me leading into this session, I want to really bring forth that I'm a strong advocate and I love to advocate for and in essence, support for making sure we're sustaining Black experiences and Black culture. That's something that's very dear to my heart and is also part of my social responsibility. For those who aren't familiar with what REAL is and what REAL stands for, REAL is Rochester's Equity and Access Leadership Conversations. These conversations focus on authentic discussions around equity, measurable actions, and meaningful change. I'm sure we kind of all see the environment that we're in today. Now more than ever, the focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as access, are central to today's pressing issues in our country and in our workplace. Really want to highlight here that the community, particularly the university, is committed to creating candid and courageous conversations and really taking an effective as well as effective actions to address any issues that arise. So as a proud alumna of the university, this is very powerful to me. So I definitely want to acknowledge the work that the university is doing. I will be remiss if I don't take a second to acknowledge the folks who have enabled the opportunity for this series to happen. So that's really the University of Rochester's Office of Alumni Relations and Constituent Engagement in partnership with the Black Alumni Network, the Institutional Office of Equity and Inclusion, as well as the Diversity Advisory Council. I always mess up on that word, but yes, the Diversity Advisory Council. Now, with that being said, as you can conceive my excitement, I'm beyond excited to host and moderate today's Q&A with our esteemed university alumnus, Dr. Warren Cretchlow. Forgive me if I butcher your name, I'm working on it. But again, I'm very elated to be here and have one of our alumnus be here to really talk about this topic beyond the darkness of the moment. I would definitely want to highlight this is definitely very personal to me. Growing up in Canada in a Caribbean household, I was not aware of Juneteenth or what Juneteenth was. And it was not until I migrated back to the United States in my early 20s for school where I got the awareness of what Juneteenth was. Yes, I felt late to the game, but the amount of awareness that is there enabled me to catch up. So I know there are many folks that have resonated with a similar story. For those who don't know what Juneteenth is also known as the National Freedom Day. It is the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery in the United States. Now, for as we talk about our communities, many of our communities really look forward and lean into this, in essence, celebration by really reading the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, or any local declaration really honoring the freedom from enslavement. Definitely want to focus on a piece here, a literature piece that is very important for us to recognize. In James C. Akike's African American Holiday Text, he writes, the reading of those documents symbolizes how our ancestors stood in front of the big house to be informed of their legal freedom. I want that to sink in for us. Now, what about the U of R? What is the U of R doing? For the month of June, the U of R has been celebrating Juneteenth with events not limiting to local and countrywide volunteering. Another big event that I really want to highlight is the Healing Circle. This was the first launch of the annual Juneteenth Health Series. Definitely check that out. If you've missed any of that, definitely check out the website. That is very powerful. I really want to highlight for us that these celebrations are intended to celebrate us, really celebrate us, highlight our constant drive for freedom, our resilience, and collective strength. Heavy heart to really say this, but also for us to give our hearts and our prayers to the victims of the mass shootings. Whew, sorry. Again, this is really heavy for me. But as we go into the rest, the respective parts of the program, I definitely do want to share some housekeeping tips for us, and particularly are some helpful Zoom tips. One, definitely making sure that you're keeping your cameras off. But if you're passionate, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A section or function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions. We do welcome those questions, and we want this to be a very engaging session. So again, looking forward to those questions. I'm not going to take up all the time, I promise, but I'd love to take the opportunity to kind of hand the mic over to Reverend Wade Norwood, class of 85, 2013, and 2020, as he leads us into prayer before we go through the second portion, which is a speaker portion of the event. Take it away, Reverend Wade.
Thank you so very much, Roshiana, and for those welcoming remarks, and good evening, family. I'll confess that even after 27 months of this being our new normal, it still is incredible to me that Lisa and I are joining you from the highway. I'm usually doing an event like this after having worked the room, hugging and laughing and just being with all of you. And then I would have been yelled at by Roshiana to stop talking and come to the stage. And I would have shared my love with the dear, dear friends on the platform or at the head table, especially when we have Warren Cretchlow as our featured guest. Y'all, Dr. Crichlow was a graduate student on the River campus back when I was an undergraduate. And by God's grace, I had the chance to come under his wing and learn some of the lessons needed to not only navigate the U of R and its culture, but also to be more than a conqueror as a lifelong scholar activist. So please know that you each have rain checks for hugs and my best wishes for your safety, health, and happiness until we can all gather together again. Before I offer it a prayer of invocation, I'd like to ask if you just join me in a moment of silence that would acknowledge the tragedy, the heinous racist murder that occurred in our neighboring city of Buffalo. And join me in honoring those lives and all those lives lost or twisted from mass shootings and all forms of violence. And after that silence, I'll ask that you join me in prayer. And we will pray in the spirit of the songstress of the 20th century civil rights movement, Sister Mahalia Jackson. If I have wounded, Lord, any soul today, Lord, if I've caused just one foot to go astray, if you find that I have been walking in my own willful way, dear Lord, forgive. If I have uttered idle words or vain, if I have turned aside from want or pain, if I failed to help others suffer through the strain, dear Lord, forgive. Forgive the sins I confess to thee, and forgive the secret sins that I don't even see. Guide us, love us, our keeper be. Dear Lord, forgive.
Um, Reverend Woodward, heavy on my heart. Thank you, thank you, thank you for that prayer. I'm like you said, we all need that extra hug right now, especially with what's going on in our world. What happened in our neighboring city in Buffalo, what happened in Texas. Healing is key. So thank you so much for leading in, us in that prayer. Now, as we transition to the next part of our agenda, again, it's still heavy here, but as we transition to the next part of our agenda, we are thrilled to acknowledge our Juneteenth programming with Dr. Warren Kreshlo. As you recognize, Reverend Woodward has some relationship with Dr. Kreshlo. It was interesting because as we connected before, he was telling about the history that they have. Reverend Woodward being a freshman coming to the U of R and having that engagement with Dr. Crutchlow is just so powerful. So we're fortunate to have you today. But who is Dr. Warren Kreshlo? And again, I apologize if I'm butchering your name. I'm infamous for doing that. So for the audience, definitely going to give you an insight to the plethora of accolades of Dr. Warren Kreshlo. So starting with his background, right? So Dr. Warren Cretchlow is actually a graduate of the Warner School of Education doctoral class of 1992. In fact, he actually taught the Warner School from 1990 to 1995 before actually moving to York University in 1996. I want to highlight too, being Canadian really saw York University. Definitely a quick, Snapple facts there. I actually went to school at York University. So there's a lot of synergies with Dr. Creshlow's background as well as mine. So really focusing on his actual background. As an associate professor in the Faculty of Education at York University in Toronto, Canada, he teaches the undergraduate and graduate programs in interdisciplinary research interests, particularly in cultural studies, Black studies, literature, and film. Now, this is where we get into the meat of Black excellence. Now, more into his accolades. So, Dr. Warren Cretchlow, he is a co-author of Race, Equity, and Representation in Education. He's also involved in co-author in Toni Morrison in the Curriculum, Cultural Studies, and Spaces for New Colonialism, Readings, Schools, Museums, and Cities in the Tumult of Globalization. Some heavy packets, so definitely take advantage in getting to some of that literature if you can. Now, I definitely want to go a little bit deeper. Dr. Warren Cretchlow actually co-authored numerous selections, some I would like to highlight for you. There's the Grand Panorama, Isaac Julian, Frederick Douglass, and the Lessons of the Hour. It's a quarterly film. And he also co-authored Curricular and Architectural Encounters with W.G. Sabat. Additionally, Unsettling Complacency, Restructuring Subjectivity. That last one is a kicker for me. That's something I'm excited to kind of really dig in and unpack, particularly for myself. Now, a piece that I think is very exciting, and I hope we all could be able to check this out. He's actually working on a monograph under the working title Extracurriculars. This is a collection of unpublished new and revised essays on artists, writers, and intellectuals whose life and intellectual contribution really reflects his extracurricular education. So again, you see all the Black excellence just hearing his accolade. I would love for you guys to help me give him a warm welcome. Come on, get those claps for Dr. Warren Kreshlo.
Let's see, get my mic on and everything on here. Thank you so much, Roshiana, I should say. Can you hear me okay? Am I on camera? Yeah, I think so. Got a bit of a sign here telling me something. Yeah, okay, thank you so much, Roshiana, for the wonderful introduction, and also Reverend Norwood. That was a wonderful prayer that you led us through, and the thought of not being in person tonight, but longing to be in person, longing to be together, longing to share space and time in these difficult times is so important. And your words of prayer and of hope and longing to be together were quite moving, and I'm really quite appreciative of those words. I'm very grateful to be here, and to want to thank the organizers of this event, the staff and supporters who worked to put it together, the university offices of alumni relations, the Black Alumni Network, the Institutional Office of Equity and Inclusion, the Diversity Council that is so well represented here, for bringing us together for this very, very special gathering. I feel particularly honored to be here for this invitation to join you tonight for a real conversation on the topic of Juneteenth and other related issues, as we will see. In fact, thank you, Wade, for remembering our encounter many, many years ago. As I was thinking about tonight, I realized, much to my chagrin, that it's nearly 42 years since I enrolled in the doctoral program at the School of Education at the University of Rochester. I don't think the school was called Warner then, and I recall that we were in the Samuel Allen Latimer Hall on the north side of the quadrangle. And I suppose that building was so sturdy, it's still there. I hope so, because I very much enjoyed my time in that building. And also one of the other places that I so enjoyed spending time in, the periodical reading room on the second floor of Rush Ree's library. I hope that periodical reading room is still there, because it's really spoiled me. There's not many reading rooms like the Rush Ree's periodical reading room, and in my current university library, there's nothing quite as wonderful as that space. And so I think if you're a student at the University of Rochester now and that reading room is still there, you really ought to be spending some very quality time there, reading and thinking and looking at the array of current journals and scholarly articles that comprise that particular location. I'm speaking, I hope my voice will hold up, because it's I'm speaking here from Norwich, England. I've been in Europe now for a couple of weeks. I arrived in London on the 10th of June, and 11th of June, actually. I flew out on the 10th, and visited my daughter, who's living in London at the moment, studying at University College London, working on a PhD, I'm proud to say. And she and I then traveled to the south of France, Nice in particular, to attend the James Baldwin conference that was scheduled to take place there. It was a very beautiful conference to attend because it brought together an array of very young poets, creative writers, aspiring essayists, thinkers, all talking about the influence of James Baldwin on their life and on their work. It was a very beautiful occasion. But the very special aspect of that conference was the opportunity to actually travel to St. Paul de Vence, the hilly rampart city that James Baldwin spent the last 17 years of his life living. He died in December 1st, 1987. And part of our day there was to continue the dialogue and discussion with young writers and poets. And also with several older uh, seniors, as I might call them, who actually were friends of Baldwin. They came on in a last session to talk about their recollections of Baldwin when he was living in St. Paul de Vince, and also when he was living abroad in other countries. And so it was a very special moment to witness. One of the powerful moments I think I take away from that experience is actually walking to the site where James Baldwin's house stood. And the house, of course, is no longer there. It's now the site of a very upscale condo development. There's been a long, ongoing struggle to try to preserve some aspect of James Baldwin's life in St. Paul de Vince. At the present moment, there is not a single plaque or recognition that Baldwin lived in the city. It was quite moving to go to that site where his house was and where he lived, to see the radical transformation of the landscape into this upscale condo development, and actually to have to peer. It's a kind of gated community, and so one has to actually peer over the wall to see, to get a sense of where his house was, and to peer through the a very sturdy iron gate to get a sense of the place. But there was the sense while we were there in St. Paul de Vince that the spirit of James Baldwin was with us, and nodding, in fact, at the efforts that we were making to think with his work and to engage with the St. Paul de Vince community to continue to find ways to acknowledge and support the work of James Baldwin through the establishment of a writer's residency space in his name. So it's a very significant moment and part of the political work as well as the cultural work of the conference. The 100+ attendees of the conference wandering through St. Paul de Vince was to send a message to the village that James Baldwin is alive and well, and that many of us from various parts of the world, America and Africa, Caribbean, are still thinking about James Baldwin and intend to return to St. Paul de Vince to continue our own work. So it's very significant. At present, Rosciana mentioned the edited volume that my colleagues and I just finished on the writer W.G. Sebald. It's a very curious project I've been working on. German emigre writer who's written very curious works of prose fiction in the last 10 to 12 years of his life. He died in 2001, just after his last work, monumental work, Austerlitz, was published. He died in a car accident. But Norwich, England, is where the University of East Anglia is located, and that's where he taught for 30 years of his life. And so I'm here 2 years delayed on a archival research project that I had intended to do in summer of 2020. It's now summer 2022, but I finally made it here 2 years later after COVID, and spending time in the archive, looking for some new material that might be useful to the next piece of writing I'd like to do on Sebald, but also spending time with the curator of an exhibition on Sebald that I attended here in 2019. And I have a very particular interest in the relationship between Sebald and the Ethiopian American painter, Julie Meritu, whose work I was quite astounded to see in the archival exhibition of Sebald's work on photography. And so I'm spending some time going back over that exhibition in hopes of developing some new thinking about the relationship between this German emigre writer and this very significant Ethiopian American artist, Julie Meritu. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that as I go forward. And also maybe we can talk about our own experiences of the campus, the University of Rochester campus itself. I have titled my comments for this evening, Beyond the Darkness of the Moment, Juneteenth, 1865 to 2022. And I sort of borrowed this notion of darkness from the scholar Eddie S. Glaude Jr., whose very significant book, Begin Again on Baldwin, has helped to further a very broad thinking about Baldwin in the world, and also his work on as a television commentator these days, and very public intellectual, I think, talking about the latest kinds of developments in the world, of course, the current political situation in the United States, particularly the Senate hearings, congressional hearings on the January 6th attack on the Capitol. So all very important kinds of issues that Eddie reads through a certain kind of Baldwinian lens. I find this work and his work very, very significant and important. Of course, thinking about 1865 to 2002, I'm thinking across a historical span of time that brings us to the current moment, where Juneteenth is now celebrated as this year is the first year of the federal holiday. And Juneteenth in the context of today's growing uncertainties is something I think I want to think about quite carefully beyond the celebratory that we often take this day to be. Of course, we want to celebrate the living and the capacity that Black people in this country have had to survive and thrive, improvise, create, make significant inroads against very, very difficult circumstances and all kinds of very powerful forms of pushback and backlash, particularly what we're seeing now. In fact, 1865 to 2022, we should remember that after emancipation, and we have to come back and think a little bit about that term, emancipation. Reconstruction occurred. There was great possibility, great strides made, but we are precisely seeing what happened in 1877 with the end of Reconstruction, a kind of similar context taking place right now, the tremendous kinds of backlash, the tremendous kinds of violence, death, that is very reminiscent of forms of lynching and terror that Black people experienced from 1877 onwards, so basically into the 1950s and into the 1960s, and certainly into today, as we have seen with the various mass shootings. that we witnessed, and the terrible, terrible death of George Floyd that the so visualized at the hands of the police. So I do want to make this connection between 1865 and 2022. Of course, the Buffalo, New York mass shooting is important for lots of reasons that we should consider, because it was carried out by an 18-year-old, 18, and of course we've had some other shootings by very young white males who've been committed to a certain kind of, or radicalized by a certain kind of racist discourse that is circulating quite widely, not just in America, but elsewhere in the world as well. 18, just out of high school, maybe not even out of high school, killed 13 people in that Buffalo shopping market, including 10 Black men and women, aged 32 to 86. 32 to 86. Astonishingly, this act of wanton violence was followed on May 24th by a mass shooting by another 18-year-old gunman who killed 19 children and 2 teachers in a primary school in Uvalde, Texas. And so this brings us right back to Texas in a certain kind of way. These 2 events, among many other unconscionable events, both domestic and international, provoke, I think, much for us to consider about Juneteenth's complex history and its still unfolding story of emancipation today, of its failed, or of the failed moral reckoning, the ongoing trauma of the moment in which we are living. What then might it mean to celebrate Juneteenth amid the darkness of today's divisive racial politics and deepening public ambivalence toward the promise of American democratic institutions? I think this is the fundamental problem that Juneteenth ought to bring us to, and we ought to organize our thinking and discussions around. Indeed, I ponder how to commemorate Juneteenth today against increasing forms of racialized resentment and backlash, framed and flamed by widely circulating manifestos like the Great Replacement, a racist conspiracy theory that white people are being replaced by minorities in the United States and elsewhere in the world. So this is not just a discourse that circulates in the US, but we've seen this replacement being articulated around other kinds of mass shootings elsewhere in the world, in Sweden, discourse in France, certainly with the right-wing turn in politics in France, and lots of writing about replacement theory in Europe right now. You should recall also the chant on January 6th, 2021, when the U.S. Capitol was stormed in an attempted coup against the 2020 presidential election. We can still hear the resonance of that chant that was so loud and vicious in a certain kind of way. You will not replace us. Stop the steal. This is part of the discourse that we live with in the current historical moment. And I think, part of the way we need to think about Juneteenth today. Now, I'm not a historian, but I am interested in history, and in fact, while I was a graduate student at the University of Rochester, I was a teaching assistant in social studies, and my undergraduate major was in history. So I have a strong interest in history and try to think historically in the kind of work that I do. But in preparing for tonight's conversation, like a good teacher, I turned to several historians and thinkers to help me reflect on Juneteenth. And fortunately, right now, I don't know if you have noticed this, but there's a number of books coming out now about Juneteenth that make it a very important time to not just celebrate, but as I want to argue here, to read and to think and to engage in collective conversations that inform us about the complexity of Juneteenth in its own formation, but also its relationship to the present historical moment in which we're living. There's much to say about this topic, which I am still learning about. I'm no expert, and so I don't intend to be comprehensive or to answer my own nascent questions, such as what is emancipation? How do we begin to think about that? What is justice, citizenship, equality, the pursuit of personhood, and what does it mean to live a life in peace? What is the right to labor for a decent living wage? All of these questions, I think, are part and parcel of how we want to be thinking about Juneteenth, not just as a celebration, but as a moment of reflection and collective engagement. I don't want to be specific, but rather offer some scattered ideas framed by an argument that Juneteenth presents a challenge to study, to read, and to engage in community with others on the most profound critical issues, both historical and contemporary, that remain implicated with this commemorative day. A commemorative day which is not a single day, but ought to be an everyday. I see the conversation tonight as a moment of community dialogue, and I do want to go back to Reverend Norwood's opening remarks. I look forward, even though we're virtual, I look forward to pursuing this discussion with you later in the Q&A. But let me start with a bit of an autobiographical admission about Juneteenth before concluding to some general remarks. Juneteenth, as Roshiana said about her growing up in Canada, I grew up in New York City, was not an active part of my life. It's neither a day I celebrated with my family, nor is it one that I recall growing up giving much attention to. Of course, growing up, I knew and heard a great deal about slavery times. I did not hear much about Juneteenth as a marker of our history. I also do not recall learning anything about Juneteenth in my primary or secondary education. I hope that's less likely to happen today for younger people, for the younger generations of today. As I think back to my undergraduate study in the early 1970s, I probably gained a vague awareness of Juneteenth. But like the 4th of July, a celebratory day that has more presence in my experience, my mood about Independence Day has grown increasingly somber over the years. On the 4th, like many of us today, I'm conscious of the words of Frederick Douglass's speech, one that we are well know. What to the slave is the 4th of July, a version of which he first delivered on July 5th, 1852 at Corinthian Hall in Rochester, New York. The occasion of that speech was one organized by the Rochester Ladies Anti-Slavery Society on the 76th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. In both written text and in what is imagined as his enormous oratorical bearing, Douglass delivered one of the great examples. And of course, he was such a great writer, speech writer, and a great deliverer of his own speeches. One of the great examples of abolitionist discourse of his day. Each year now, and we each 4th of July, this speech appears online and everywhere, quoted in various versions and parts. It's a rather long text, and I don't think we know as much about that text as we ought to. But it is a text that now resonates with such prescience in the moment that we hear it today on the 4th of July. I do want to just read a little bit of that from that quote, probably the most well recognized part of it. And I quote, "What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than any other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is a constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham. Your boasted liberty an unholy license. Your national greatness, swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless." And there's more to that famous paragraph that Douglass penned and spoke that day in 1852. But at the end of it, he says very powerfully, "There is not a nation on earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour." That's a very powerful moment, and we can see from 1852 to 2022 the continuity of observation and reality, in fact, that Douglass so presciently understood and therefore carries so powerfully into the present moment in which we live. Indeed, some of you may have seen Isaac Julian's Lessons of the Hour at the Memorial Art Gallery in Rochester. And so this reproduction of that speech is very, very powerful and it should remind us very clearly of the significance of Douglass today. Indeed, Douglass's modulating voice was critical of and simultaneously espoused love for the country to which he remained a committed patriot until his death in 1895. Of course, Douglass's life was quite complex, quite a life of engagement, a life of contradiction, a life of family, a life of publicity, a life of wealth and a life of poverty, a life of family, and producing sons and daughters who went on to carry on his work. A great lover of literature and art, a great thinker in the Shakespearean tradition, and also a figure who was well aware of continental philosophy, of his age. It was a very significant thinker to think with. He's one person that I'm again turning to in my own work. I'll say a bit more about that momentarily. Despite the dark picture that Douglass presented of an America unwilling to turn away from the defining violent reliance on human bondage, Douglass's 4th of July speech nevertheless concluded with a resolutely forward-looking vision. I think here is where we have to read the full text, because it's a remarkable piece of writing, the way he begins and the way he ends, the way he draws in his audience, the way he reaches certain forms of crescendo. This kind of speech act for which Douglass is famous is really, you can grasp it in the reading of the full text itself. But at the very end of that text, I just want to move to the very end of the text, because it's there that Douglass, despite the darkness, becomes resolutely forward-looking in his vision and hopeful in a particular kind of way. And he writes the following, I quote, "I do not despair for this country," unquote. And he goes on to say, "I do not despair because there are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery." And as we know of Douglass's long, complex life, he worked head and heart to achieve a vision of complete abolition that began, of course, in 1865, and for which he continued to fight through the good days of Reconstruction and the terrible days of the Black Codes and Jim Crow and the KKK, and the tremendous amount of lynching that marked and marred the late part of the 19th century until his death in 1895. In fact, one of his last speeches, Lessons of the Hour, was a speech about lynching, which he delivered in various versions across the country as a very, very old man. And he was astounded by the violence of lynching, and brought his voice to bear on that question. On July 5th, 1852, Douglass gave the 4th of July speech. That was 13 years before Juneteenth. Douglass encouraged in that speech all in the Rochester audience to strive to break the rod and rend the guide of any and all forces shackling and fettering the spirit of the still young nation that Douglass so loved. Douglass anticipated, however, that this was not going to be a short battle, that it was going to be a long-term struggle, and indeed we are seeing that today. Douglass anticipated this struggle, and that's part of the reason why we continue to heed Douglass's words. Douglass, like Baldwin, like many of the 19th century and early 20th century thinkers, come back and return to us as critical resources for thinking and surviving in the present. And so I do want to, on this Juneteenth conversation that we are having, insist upon the importance of returning to these thinkers and thinking with them in the particular context in which we are living, both inside the university and outside the university as well. It's now 147 years since the last Confederate army surrendered in Galveston, Texas. The Civil War which claimed some 700,000 lives had been fought to preserve slavery as a Southern way of life. Or as the argument went, and as it still goes today, states' rights. I think, of course, we're seeing the question of states' rights at the epicenter of the Roe v. Wade debate, which will soon, any day now, be rendered by the very politicized Supreme Court. Supreme Court that now is dominated by conservative judges, a good many of them put in place over the 4 years of the Trump administration. The final battles of the Civil War in Texas realized the abolition of legal slavery for the nation. I think this is what makes Juneteenth significant, and I think we'll see why in shortly. At the time of the Civil War, the United States was comprised of 36 states, and constitutionally, while the Civil War ended, slavery did not end until some 6 months later, after June 19th, 1865, with the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which required, of course, 3/4 of the then 36 states to ratify that amendment. And that amendment, of course, says that slavery in the Constitution, slavery can be no more. Slavery is not part and will not be tolerated in the United States. Of course, that then becomes something that has to be actualized and realized over a number of years, and it was a very difficult struggle as you think about the history of the matter. Going from Plessy versus Ferguson in 1996, which made not slavery but segregation the law of the land, to the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1952, finally overturned Plessy and began a second reconstruction with the civil rights movement and integration of schools and public services and so on. Long, complicated story, but one we ought to be thinking about again at this time of Juneteenth. Now, one of the, well, let me just back up again to 13th Amendment. I think one of the striking things about the 13th Amendment is that it took a number of years to realize. Douglas, of course, Frederick Douglass, of course, was an advocate of the going to war to end slavery, to fight the Confederacy. Was all evidence of Lincoln making becoming a driving force to make constitutional change to rid the nation of slavery. Remember, slavery is so, and its place in the nation is ambivalent. There's an ambivalence, of course, among the founding fathers, and this is part of the debate that continues to take place around the Constitution itself and its interpretations. Particular ambivalence that requires interpretation that then becomes politicized in many kinds of ways. Anyway, Lincoln began the process of the 13th Amendment in 1864. And of course, he was assassinated before the 13th Amendment was ratified. He was assassinated on April 16th of 1865, some 7 or 8 months before its actual ratification. So this is, I think, a very significant moment to think about. In reading Annette Gordon Reed's, and I highly recommend this book. There's many books now out on Juneteenth, but I found Annette Gordon Reed's slim memoirist text, aptly titled on Juneteenth to be, a very important primer for my understanding of Juneteenth. I knew so little about it in its actuality, its actual history. I learned that on June 19th, or what we now call Juneteenth, as it's become known, has particular significance for African Americans in Texas. It's really a Texas event. On that day in the port city of Galveston, some 60 miles east of Houston on the Gulf of Mexico, Major General Gordon Granger issued General Order Number 3, a statement that announced the end of the slave institution in that holdout state. The fulfillment in June 19th of 1865 of the Proclamation Emancipation of 1863. So we have this, we have a number of moments here of emancipation, beginning with the 1863 emancipation, I would argue, the surrender of Lee to Grant in April of 1865, and then again, the announcement that slavery time was over in Galveston later that year. So interesting, which date do we celebrate? Which date do we think about? Which date is the important one for us to remember and to bring our remembrance around in the present historical conjuncture in which we live. Word that slavery time was over in Galveston quickly spread among enslaved Black people of Texas. Although, as Gordon Reed writes, there is evidence to suggest that the word spreading and celebration had begun several days prior to Major General Granger's order. No doubt Black folk in Texas had been watching events very closely and were not passively waiting to be told that their time has come. So Texas, this I think is very important. Texas is significant because it is the last battleground of the American Civil War. Remember that Lee surrendered to Grant, the Confederate Army to Grant in Appomattox in April of 1865. But the Confederate Army, the rest of the Confederate Army, fled further into Texas to make a certain kind of last stand. In fact, the last battles of the Civil War in Texas were won by the Confederacy. But there were tremendous losses, and word slowly began to filter in that that Lee had surrendered and had settled with the Union, and there were tremendous loss of fighters, and this allowed the Union to finally bring the battle to cessation in Texas. I think this is also rather important because Juneteenth signifies not merely the end of the war over the peculiar institution of American slavery, but the beginning of the long post-emancipation struggle for freedom. Therefore, it is in some sense fitting that the events in Texas symbolize the end of slavery, and that June 19th evolved from the kinds of claims and celebrations that Black Texans made during that period to the rest of the nation, and hence becoming a national holiday that now acknowledges emancipation in a particular kind of way. Now, lots more to say. I'm sort of looking at my time here, and I think I'm running a bit short. But the important thing here to think about is that Black Texans created the Juneteenth holiday, as a historian like Gordon Reed argues, as a celebration of the freedom of people they actually knew. And this is what makes Reed Gordon's writing so significant, because it really is embedded in her own experience as a child growing up in Texas, her family who has long roots in Texas, family who actually lived in slavery, and the stories that were passed down, and her own becoming a young woman who, after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, is one of the first children to integrate schools in her community. So it's a very important story, very rich story, and one that's very readable and accessible, and one that also, I think, expands our capacity to inquire further into the history of Texas, which is really a kind of microcosm of American history itself. There's so much about Texas in this book that we don't really think about. Texas as a place that begins with the settlement of settlers from the South who were committed to a cotton economy, and a cotton economy that could not actually take place until unless there was slavery. This was something that the Mexicans were not very approving of, and caused a great deal of conflict, which led, of course, to the struggle between the settlers and Mexico, and the eventual liberation of what then becomes Texas as its own country for 11 years. I hadn't quite gotten this in my head. And interestingly enough, Reed Gordon describes the constitution of the nation of Texas as one that was predicated on slavery for life. In fact, you couldn't, if you were Black, you could not be free in Texas, could not be a freedman. It's inconceivable, written into the Constitution of Texas. Of course, the struggle with Mexico continues, the struggle with the indigenous populations in that area continues. The Texans of the time agree that the best way to proceed to secure their future is to join the American Union, which they do in 1845. And hence America joins those Texans in the battle with Mexico that then annexes much of Mexico into what is now Texas and other parts of that region. So it's a very fascinating story, and one that I don't think we, again, talk enough about and when we come to this celebration we now call Juneteenth. I recently came across a site, Vulture, that offers a reading list, what they call a Juneteenth reading list. Many interesting books there that we ought to be thinking about. Gordon Reed's book is in that list. Also, my colleague in Toronto, at the University of Toronto, Ronaldo Walcott, whose very critical text, The Long Emancipation, Moving Toward Black Freedom, which he really makes an argument that emancipation has not really been achieved yet. We are still in the place of a long emancipation that whose ending still has not been realized. So this is another kind of work, I think that was really quite significant for us to listen to. I think I'm just about out of time, so I think I'll stop there and see what kind of discussion might emerge.
Dr. Kreshlo, there's a lot of unpacking that can definitely, that will ensue because of this very thought-provoking dialogue. So one, I want to give you your flowers acknowledging the depth of knowledge, research, your own extracurricular passion, the literature that you put forth, and your respective co-authors. I want to say thank you for that. Those flowers are needed. The continuation of legacy of history in the current times, the humanities, the continuation of preservation of our culture is so powerful. As I mentioned in the beginning, advocating and sustaining for cultures, particularly Black experiences, inclusive of history, is very dear to me. So as an immigrant, as a Canadian immigrant, similar to yourself, where not having that much exposure to Juneteenth in your upbringing has been limited, I thank you for continuing to preserve that literature, especially as, these younger generations kind of take their ways of getting that low of information. So again, thank you. I'm going to do a quick synopsis because you touched on a lot from James Baldwin, right? Going in person and visiting, and you're seeing the ratification, I won't call it gentrification, but the ratification of that history there. You talk about the excerpt from Frederick Douglass as it pertains to July 4th. You talk about the synergies between Baldwin and Sebald, and I'm excited to hear about that. Again, you touched on your own experience growing up as a New York City, Black American and that limited exposure. We even heard your sentiment around the insurrection in January. I talked about, the literature about how we stood in front of the big house to be legally acknowledge that we are legally free while we saw what happened on January 6th to preserve the status quo, right? So definitely contrast there. We talked about the mass shootings, domestically and abroad, and really want to bring on that prevalence of particularly within our communities that we're seeing. And, really bring that awareness. You talk about emancipation. Is that really here? And the reason why I say that is a couple of days before Juneteenth, a Black vet was lynched in Pennsylvania, right? Days before Juneteenth. So, hearing what you're saying and so getting in and getting that optimism of what Frederick Douglass said, saying that it's not, he didn't expect it to be an easy challenge. And this really leads into my question that I have for you. I had a different order, but that piece resonated with my soul. Two parts, right? In this moment in history that we are experiencing, and there's many angles, what are your thoughts? How do you think, James Baldwin will categorize this time in history? And on top of that, I want to hear your perspective on how Frederick Douglass would acknowledge that too as well. He talked about it being a while, but it's been 131 years since Frederick Douglass passing, and we're going through different renditions, but some of the same struggles. I want to hear your thoughts. What would these two powerful change makers say or characterize this moment in history as? I know that was heavy. I'm sorry, but I really want to hear your thoughts.
Well, it's I teach a graduate seminar on it's called biography in education, and we actually start with the first autobiography of Douglass, and then move to what I think is a very important text in Baldwin's work, No Name in the Street from 1972. And it's very important to think about what would Douglass and what would Baldwin say to us. I think we know what they would say to us. This is precisely why their work and their thinking and their lives continue to resonate in the present. Why Baldwin, in fact, a writer and a figure who was so, denied during the latter part of his life, continues to return in his significance in the present moment. I think both of these writers in different ways would ask us to think about what it means to engage in the long-term work of abolition. Of course, abolition is a very important concept right now, particularly with the more specific issue of prison reform and abolishing the kinds of carceral systems and forms of surveillance and so on that we continue to live with, but also abolition of all kinds of forms of inequality and injustice that mark the world. I think both of these writers would continue to uh, push us to and past the kinds of despair that these moments bring, and insist that we continue to work to and struggle against all forms of oppression and injustice. Of course, both of these men near the end of their lives in different ways faced a certain kind of recognition that things were not quite going the way they had hoped. Certainly, Douglas facing a very difficult moment, the return of a certain kind of Jim Crowism, died just before the Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, which returned made segregation the law of the land. Of course, he saw all of this coming. Baldwin, of course, by the end of the 1960s, had witnessed so much death. All of his friends died: Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, many young civil rights workers in the South, the brutality of the movement, and then the rise of the Black Power movement and a kind of radicalization of Black resistance tended to push him out of the way. So he was very, I wouldn't say depressed, but he was on the edge of his resolve by the end of the 1960s. And of course, we know that he retreated into Istanbul and then into France to write. But this is what makes, I think, that 1972 text one that Eddie Glaude speaks about very significantly, an important transitional text, because he has to rethink things. And he has to, as Eddie Glaude puts it on the cover of his book, and as Baldwin articulated it in that text, begin again. And I think once we face the kind of dire moments, these enormous tragedies that continue to happen, the uncertainty and unsafety, Baldwin, of course, argued that there was no safety. Douglas certainly lived a life that wasn't very safe. They would both encourage us to continue to live our lives and to struggle and to not give in to the unsafety of the world in which we live. And that's certainly key to making change and also creating a space and a place for the next generations who will continue to struggle in their own way and under their own particular kinds of conditions.
Thank you so much. And, to even hear that. And it's interesting you stepped on, didn't. You kind of, spoke on, Baldwin's retreat to Istanbul, etc. This question might get a little personal, but I'm always here for pushing the boundaries. That's just me naturally. What we saw, especially, and I like to really gear some of this towards the millennial, but also being cognizant of the wider population. During the last election, the last two elections, you saw a flock of a lot of Americans go towards Canada, right? We saw in the last election that our citizenship website crashed, the Canadian website crashed. That's one example. You see a lot of Black Americans start to travel or decide to either take expats or leave America because we talk about the tumult with globalization, but the impact on our mental health, that what's going on in this country is starting to kind of shape years of our lives, right? Again, talking about that migration to Canada, I do have this question because as a Canadian, I grew up, I didn't realize I was Black till I came to this country. That was a social construct I struggled with when I was in my 20s because Growing up in Jamaica, I was Jamaican. Even though I was physically Black in Canada, I was never referred to as a Black, despite being my family being the only Black family in our neighborhood in my school, right? So my question here to you, Doctor, is, are there similar issues Black Canadians are facing in Canada? And, how do they relate, if they do or lack thereof, relate to the social issues that are going on here in the United States?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that question. I mean, of course, there's been a long history of relation between Black Americans and Canada. Of course, we can take this back to the Black loyalists who fought for the British in the American Revolution, and then for their commitment to British rule. The British made space for them in Nova Scotia, and so many migrated to Nova Scotia. We had one of the first large-scale Black communities in Canada, in Nova Scotia at the end of the 18th century. Of course, one of the things that Canada doesn't acknowledge very well is the fact that it was part of, it was a slave society, it had slavery. One of important art historian, Black art historian, who's astoundingly the only Black art historian in the entire country. University. Charmaine Nelson has written quite significantly on this issue and has done archival work that uncovered advertisements in Canada for the return of runaway slaves. So it's quite an astounding history. Now, one of the things I always I don't think African Americans are aware of is the scale of Canada. There are more African Americans in the United States than the entire population of Canada by about 10 million. Canada has probably 35 or 37 million people. There are somewhere 47, 48 million African Americans in the United States. So this is a scale of experience is really quite different. And Canada is a very large landmass, and so we don't have large cities like the United States, but we do have parallel issues. We have a large immigrant population. Oceania, of course, large Jamaican population, large Caribbean population, large diasporic population, Africa, lots of, interestingly enough, one of the first things that struck me when I moved to Canada is the number of South Asian people with very thick Jamaican accents or Caribbean accents. It's quite an eye opener to walk into a place and it's not Black people in the strict sense, but other kinds of people. South Asian people have a different kind of history and relationship to the Caribbean. Of course, many of the same issues, police shootings, uncertainty, inequality, injustice. We share, of course, a space with the Indigenous population of Canada. We just had terrible revelations of residential schools in which mass graves around the Catholic churches that ran these schools have been discovered. Very shocking development. Mental health certainly is a big issue because many of the police shootings, tragic police shootings, the majority of them involve people who were suffering with mental health issues. In fact, a number of them involved the people themselves calling the police for assistance, and when the police arrive, the altercation escalates into the person winding up dead. And so we have these kinds of parallel issues in Canada, except the scale is somewhat different. And there is a sense that because there is a kind of multicultural policy brought in by the Trudeau government in the early 70s, that there is a sense that, we don't have the kind of melting pot that people can have this kind of outer national relation. You can be Jamaican and Canadian too. You can be Nigerian and Canadian too. You can you can be a Barbadian and Jamaican too, and so on. These are the kind of issues that both open up a certain sense of well-being for Black people in Canada, but also disappoint in very considerable ways. Now, last thing I want to say about this is that it's shocking that we have a kind of conservative government now in the province of Ontario, where I live, where Toronto is located. We've just had an election. The Minister of Education, speaks for the entire province of Ontario, which is the largest, most populous province, most diverse province in Canada. It was revealed that in 2005, this Minister of Education participated in a slave auction to raise funds for his fraternity. Now, fraternity itself, that dates back to the 1870s and was founded on a kind of commitment to white male Christian supremacy. Having a slave auction in 2005, nothing happened. Complete immunity, complete incapacity to hold this Minister of Education to account, re-elected, and will continue to run education. In fact, the premier of the governor, is called the premier in Canada, said that this figure is the best friend of diversity that the province has. So these are the kinds of issues that we face in Canada. I think these are very parallel to America, although the scale itself is somewhat different.
To your point, as we work towards this abolitionist mindset, and as we continue to advocate for change, it's driving accountability in those manners. We've seen similar instances in the workplace. And again, for us to continue to work and walk in our light, walk in our passion, and hold others accountable as much as we own accountability with ourselves, it's key. So thank you for really bringing that highlight that even though Canada is this melting pot, we too have our own challenges there that are becoming more on the forefront. I know we're coming up to the top of the hour, so I definitely want to get to some of the questions in the chat. So bear with me, I'll take maybe about one or two. So I'll go with Dr. Joe Hicks. Very heavy sentiment, but definitely would love to get your thoughts. So Dr. Hicks mentions, Dr. Kreshlo, thank you for this webinar. I believe, quote, the dark metaphor and example of linguistics, racial oppression. When anyone speaks metaphorically of that dark, it's bad. And knowing that language is the foundational structure, identify the phrase as a microaggression. Would you address my belief in response? The term dark metaphor, an example of linguistics, racial oppression.
I think I used the term dark times, and the times are dark. I don't think that this is a metaphor that is not has a negative linguistic connotation that may have something. I'm not sure what the question is driving towards, but I wouldn't see using dark as a linguistic term that reflects negatively on darkness. It's about the social character of the moment. We could say that the moment is bright and white, but that wouldn't give another kind of connotation of happiness and well-being. But there's a kind of darkness that is pervading the social reality, a kind of evil. I think the darkness relates to a certain kind of evil and a kind of disavowal of the way in which we as humans ought to relate to one another and ought to relate to the planet. I mean, this darkness is just not about the kinds of social relations that we are living, the forms of racism that are arising, the kinds of discourses of replacement theory that we mentioned that are so powerful at the moment, but also the, the darkness that is pervading the very environment, an environmental crisis in which we are living, global warming, the degradation of many parts of, of the world, famine, um, increasing extreme weather conditions. There is a kind of darkness that COVID itself, as a kind of expression of the darkening times in which we are living. So I think um, darkness is an appropriate kind of term to begin to think about um, the world in which we're living and the kinds of analyses and the kinds of engagement and the kinds of struggles that we continue to need to fight. Now, you know, the darker brother. I think this, the black of the berry. I mean, these are all other kinds of metaphors that we go to for sustenance and as resources for continuing the kind of struggles that we engage. So language is complex. And I think we have to think about language closely, but also contextually, and try to mobilize language in a way that sort of helps us to say the kinds of things that we want to say and to make the kinds of observations and point out the kinds of things that we need to point out. That's a very interesting question. It hadn't occurred to me to to think darkness as a kind of negative linguistic, having a negative linguistic connotation, such as the questioner has suggested.
There, thank you. I was like, where did I go on mute? So thank you so much, and thank you for giving, your perspective around, that metaphoric and linguistics narrative. I know we are definitely at the top of the hour, so I definitely want to close with this last heavy question, very provoking, but we really need, I think this is the perfect way to kind of close out. And pardon me because this will be a mouthful, and as I struggle to speak with this gap, I'll jump right in. So, in your work, you reckon with this question. What then might it mean to celebrate Juneteenth amid the darkness of today's divisive racial politics and deepening public ambivalence towards the promise of American democratic institutions? So that is a question, right? And give a second to reflect because, again, no, this is heavy. Kind of to the question on hand here. For you, as you think about your life, your success, and how you've navigated those polarizing spaces. How can Black Americans navigate such polarizing politics and public spaces? So I know we have a few minutes, so we'll make this a quick one, and then we'll be able to close out shortly after. So again, how should Americans or how can Americans navigate polarizing politics and public spaces while still being able to celebrate Juneteenth? And we touched on mental health a bit, right? Where it's not eroding at that mental health, but still being able to navigate effectively and efficiently.
Yeah. Well, celebration is, of course, important and essential to life, and certainly it's been core to Black life. I mean, it's one of the sustaining aspects of the way Black people have been able to sustain themselves over time through music and dance, food, the breaking of bread together, no matter how meager the meal might be. So I think celebration is important. Of course, music is one of the most celebratory aspects of Black life, from gospel to blues to R&B to jazz. I mean, it's a tremendous amount of creativity and celebration in the music itself. Reverend Norwood uh, mentioned Mahalia Jackson at the beginning of his comments, and to go online, for instance, or in YouTube, and to find some of the video of her singing. It's simply amazing. A celebration, in fact, and the way that she moves people and a congregation. All of these moments, I think, are part of the cultural resources of celebration that become part of sustaining our lives. It's hard to say. I was thinking about this actually, because one of the things I wanted to say is that, at the University of Rochester is a very difficult place, I know, and for Black students and Black faculty and so on over the years. When I think about my own experience there, I say, it was such a wonderful, memorable time there, and I learned so much. And I went in the graduate school. There was one Black professor in the graduate school. I'm talking about his name now. He actually was in counseling, in psychology and counseling. But in my area, in curriculum instruction and some of the other areas, there were no Black faculty. But I had really significant white faculty members, and many of whom I'm still in touch with. And I'm still working with, and so on over all those years. So it was I don't know what made it possible for me to move through and to do the kinds of things. Being in the right place at the right time, having a bit of luck, and being interested in things, and having mentors and family that were supportive. I think these are still the elements that can account for how we negotiate our lives. And of course, as you've said earlier, to really try to hold on to our mental health and our health, eating right, thinking right, exercising, participating in worlding, in the making of a world, and also reaching beyond ourselves to move in the world, to understand that that the world, as Baldwin said, much bigger than the United States, and much greater and much more dangerous, but also much more beautiful than anything that we might imagine in the world. And these are the kinds of things I think that we to the extent that we can, hold on to and share with others, especially if we're educators and teachers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kreshlo. That just even hearing you close out with that remark is how, we navigate these spaces, politics, etc. And, what the spirit of Juneteenth is to celebrate us, right? Highlight our drive for freedom. And with that being said, Dr. Kreshlo, I again want to give you your flowers. Thank you for your insights, your knowledge, and your experience. And, continue to be an amazing alumnus of the U of R. We appreciate your impact on us and the humanities. So again, thank you so much. To my audience, we had you for a while. I hope you were able to resonate. Something here was able to resonate with you and how you carry on with your day to day. And as we work to that better future, the abolitionist mindset, pardon me, that we continue to drive that accountability with ourselves, with our organizations, and so forth, while managing our mental health, our physical health, etc. So with that being said, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We definitely invite you to join our upcoming events, and stay tuned for the next installment of the Real Conversation this upcoming academic year, so fall 2022. And as always, if you want to learn more information, visit the Real Conversations website, definitely available to you. And again, to the staff, faculty, and alumni that have been a part of this, thank you guys so much for making this happen. To our audience, you will definitely be directed to a survey. We do appreciate your feedback on this program and also suggestions for future sessions, because this is really about us, right? How can we improve ourselves, the community, and how can the U of R and the respective offices really support us throughout our journeys? Again, thank you, and Meliora to all of us.